How did a sleepover dare end with 3 of my friends on life support? The dare started as a joke during Aiden's 16th birthday sleepover, the kind of stupid challenge that sounds hilarious at midnight when you're running on energy drinks and the invincibility of adolescence. We were in his basement, me, Aiden, Marcus Whitley, Javier Lopez, and Finn Gallagher, playing truth or dare, like we were still in middle school instead of juniors in high school. Aiden had just dared Finn to text his crush a confession, and Finn had countered by saying the next dare had to be legendary, or he wasn't playing anymore. That's when Marcus pulled up a video on his phone showing teenagers climbing a water tower in some rural town, standing at the very top with the whole world spread out beneath them. The video had over 2 million views and comments full of people calling the climbers legends and saying they wished they had the guts to try it. Marcus looked at us with this challenge in his eyes and said we should climb the old Riverside water tower before graduation, document it like the video, and become legends at school. I laughed initially because the Riverside water tower was easily 150 feet tall, a rusted relic from the 1960s that the city kept threatening to demolish but never actually did. It sat on the edge of an abandoned industrial park where homeless camps had sprouted up among the vacant warehouses. The tower had been fenced off for years with warning signs about structural instability and criminal trespassing, and every local kid knew at least one story about someone falling from it or getting arrested trying to climb it. But Marcus kept pressing, saying the danger was exactly what made it worth doing, that we'd be the first ones from our school to actually pull it off and get footage. Aiden was immediately interested because his birthday was in 2 days, and he wanted to do something memorable. Finn said he'd do it if everyone else did, his competitive streak overriding his common sense. Javier stayed quiet, which usually meant he was calculating risks and would eventually decide it was too dangerous. I was the swing vote, and everyone was looking at me to either kill the idea or greenlight it. My stomach twisted with doubt, because I'd always been the careful one in our group, the one who suggested we take the safe path when everyone else wanted to do something reckless. But I was also tired of being careful. Tired of watching other people take risks while I played it safe and wondered what I was missing. Senior year was approaching, and I'd barely done anything worth remembering. Hadn't kissed anyone or broken any rules or created stories I'd tell my kids someday. The thought of climbing that tower terrified me, but the thought of being the only one who refused terrified me more. So I said yes, and the energy in the room shifted immediately. Marcus started planning out loud. We'd go Friday night when it was dark, bring flashlights and phones for documentation, and climb to the top where we'd take the legendary photo. Finn downloaded a video editing app so we could make a proper montage. Aiden researched the tower online and found old maintenance documents showing the ladder route and platform specifications. Javier finally agreed to come, but insisted we bring safety equipment, maybe rope or harnesses, which everyone immediately dismissed as too complicated and unnecessary. The next 3 days felt like the countdown to something simultaneously exciting and catastrophic. I couldn't focus in class because I kept imagining the climb, my hands on rusty metal rungs in the dark, the ground falling away beneath me with only grip strength keeping me alive. My mom noticed I was distracted and asked if something was bothering me, and I almost told her everything right then, but I knew what would happen. She'd forbid me from going, maybe call Aiden's parents, definitely destroy the tentative reputation I was trying to build as someone interesting rather than just safe. So I lied and said I was stressed about a test, and she believed me because I'd never given her reason not to. Thursday night, Marcus texted our group chat with a message that should have been a red flag. Found the weak spot in the fence. Access is easy. Nobody will see us. Meet at my car, 11 p.m. Friday. Wear dark clothes. The casualness of his planning made the whole thing seem more legitimate somehow, like this was a normal activity we were preparing for, rather than something that could get us arrested or killed. Friday evening, I told my parents I was sleeping over at Aiden's house, which was technically true since that was the plan after we climbed the tower. They didn't question it because I'd been going to Aiden's for sleepovers since elementary school. I packed a bag with overnight clothes and my phone charger, and my dad drove me to Aiden's house at 8 o'clock. Aiden's parents were out at dinner, which was why we'd chosen Friday. They always went to their favorite restaurant and wouldn't be home until 11, giving us the perfect window to sneak out. The 5 of us gathered in Aiden's basement pretending to play video games while actually reviewing the plan obsessively. Marcus had screenshots of the tower from Google Maps showing the access point he'd identified. Finn had fully charged his phone and cleared space for video footage. Javier was quieter than usual, and when I asked if he was okay, he said he had a bad feeling but couldn't articulate why. I should have listened to that instinct. Should have said we could back out and nobody would think less of us. Instead, I told him it would be fine, and that we'd be careful, words that would haunt me for years afterward. At exactly 11 o'clock, we piled into Marcus's beat-up Nissan Altima and drove toward the industrial park on the river's edge. The 15-minute drive felt surreal, passing through our familiar town that looked different and sinister in the dark. The streetlights got sparser as we approached the abandoned area, and soon we were driving on cracked pavement with weeds growing through it, past buildings with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. Marcus pulled onto a dirt access road and killed his headlights, driving slowly by the light of the moon until we saw the tower rising against the night sky like a giant skeletal hand reaching for the stars. It was bigger than I'd remembered from driving past it, the cylindrical tank perched atop a lattice of steel girders that looked impossibly fragile and impossibly tall. The fence surrounding it was chain-link topped with barbed wire, but Marcus navigated to the section he'd found where the bottom had been peeled back, creating a gap wide enough to crawl through. We parked and sat in silence for a moment, and I think we were all realizing the magnitude of what we were about to do. The tower looked different up close, more industrial and dangerous than it had in Marcus's phone videos. Rust stained the metal in long orange streaks, and some of the cross-bracing looked corroded enough that I could see gaps where bolts should have been. Finn was the first to speak, saying we should establish ground rules. Stay together, help anyone who got scared, and leave immediately if anyone said they wanted to stop. Everyone agreed, and we sealed it with a fist bump that felt ceremonial and binding. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and led us to the fence gap, dropping to his belly and wiggling through while we followed one by one. The dirt on the other side was littered with trash and broken glass, and the smell of urine and decay made me gag. We'd entered the homeless encampment area, and I could see makeshift shelters in the shadows between buildings, tarps strung over shopping carts and clusters of people sleeping rough. Marcus whispered that we needed to move quietly and quickly to avoid being seen. The base of the tower was surrounded by another fence, this one in worse condition with entire sections missing. We stepped through a gap and found ourselves at the foot of the massive structure. Looking up made me dizzy. The ladder stretched so high that I couldn't see the top platform in the darkness, just the silhouette of the tank against the slightly lighter sky. The ladder was inside a protective cage made of curved metal bars, meant to prevent falls, but also making it impossible to bail out once you started climbing. Marcus went first, testing his weight on the bottom rungs which groaned but held. He started ascending with Finn right behind him, then Aiden, then me, with Javier bringing up the rear. The metal was cold even through my gloves, and I could feel every vibration from the guys climbing above me. The first 50 feet weren't terrible because I could still see the ground and convince myself I could jump if necessary. But as we climbed higher, that illusion disappeared, and the reality set in. We were committed now. Stuck. In this cage with no way off, except up or down. Around 70 feet up, Aiden stopped climbing suddenly, and the whole chain of people had to freeze. He said his hands were cramping, and he needed a minute. We all clung to the ladder, breathing hard, while my muscles screamed from holding my body weight on narrow metal rungs. Below us, Javier was breathing in short, panicked gasps that suggested he was having the same realization I was. This was insane, and we'd made a terrible mistake. Above us, Marcus was encouraging Aiden to keep going, saying we were more than halfway, and the hardest part was behind us. That was a lie. The hardest part was still ahead, because the last 30 feet of ladder had visible rust damage, sections where the metal looked paper-thin and about to disintegrate. But we kept climbing because what else could we do? Going down seemed harder than continuing up at this point, and nobody wanted to be the one who gave up and forced everyone to retreat. So we climbed, rung by agonizing rung, while the wind picked up and made the entire structure sway slightly, just enough to remind us we were on an unstable tower that hadn't been maintained in decades. When Marcus finally reached the top platform and hoisted himself over the edge, his whoop of victory echoed through the night air. Finn joined him seconds later, then Aiden, then me, pulling myself up with shaking arms onto a metal platform that felt surprisingly solid under my feet. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. We'd made it. We'd actually climbed this massive tower in the dark and survived. The view was incredible despite my terror. The entire city spread out below us with lights twinkling like stars brought down to earth. I could see our school's football field, the mall parking lot, even my neighborhood on the far edge of town. Javier pulled himself up last and immediately sat down with his back against the tank, his face pale and his hands trembling. But we'd done it. We were standing on top of the Riverside Water Tower at midnight, 5 teenage idiots who'd accomplished something simultaneously impressive and stupid. Marcus started filming with his phone, doing a slow pan of the view while narrating about how we'd just become legends. Finn posed at the edge of the platform, arms spread wide like he was king of the world, and I took photos of everyone living their moment of triumph. That's when we heard the voices below. At first, I thought it was wind, or my imagination, but then I heard it clearly. Men shouting, multiple voices, aggressive and angry. We all froze and looked over the edge of the platform. Far below, illuminated by flashlights, I could see a group of 6 or 7 men surrounding the base of the tower. They were yelling up at us, their words initially indistinct, but the hostility unmistakable. Marcus leaned over further, trying to hear what they were saying, and that's when the first rock hit the tank near his head with a metallic clang that made us all jump. Someone was throwing rocks at us. Someone was actively trying to hit us while we were 150 feet in the air with nowhere to go. Aiden yelled down, asking what they wanted, and the response came back crystal clear this time. "Get the fuck down here now, or we're coming up to get you." The threat was clear, the menace in their voices obvious even from this distance. We'd trespassed on what these men apparently considered their territory, and they were furious about it. Javier asked if we should call the police, and Marcus immediately shut that down, saying we'd get arrested for trespassing, and our parents would kill us. Finn suggested we wait them out, that they'd eventually get bored and leave. But another rock hit the platform near Finn's foot, close enough that if his position had been different, it would have struck him directly. These weren't warning shots. These men were genuinely trying to hit us, and from their accuracy, they'd clearly done this before. The situation was escalating from uncomfortable to dangerous, and we needed to make a decision. I suggested we start climbing down slowly and carefully, that we'd have to face these men eventually, and delaying would only make them angrier. Aiden agreed, and we started organizing ourselves for the descent. Marcus went first again, swinging himself over the edge and finding the top rungs of the ladder. Finn followed, then me, then Aiden, with Javier last. The climb down was harder than up because I could see exactly how far I'd fall if I slipped, could see the men gathering at the base getting more agitated as we descended. We were maybe 40 feet down when I heard Javier scream above me. I looked up and saw him dangling from one hand, his feet scrambling for purchase on rungs that had broken away beneath him. The rusted section I'd worried about during the climb up had finally given way, and Javier was hanging by his left hand from a rung that was visibly bending under his weight. Above him, Aiden was frozen in place, too far away to reach Javier, but close enough to see the terror on his face. Javier's hand was slipping, his glove sliding on the rusty metal, and he was making this horrible gasping sound as he tried to pull himself up with one arm. I watched him struggle for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 seconds before his grip failed completely. He fell past me so fast I barely registered it. A dark shape plummeting through the ladder cage, bouncing off one of the protective bars which altered his trajectory, then hitting the ground with a sound I'll never forget. A wet crunch that echoed through the industrial park, followed by absolute silence from below. Everything after that happened in chaotic fragments. Marcus and Finn reaching the ground and running to Javier's body. Me and Aiden scrambling down the remaining ladder section so fast we both burned our hands on the metal, reaching the base and seeing Javier lying at an impossible angle, his leg bent wrong and blood pooling beneath his head. The men who'd been threatening us were backing away now, their bravado gone, clearly not having expected this outcome. Finn was on his phone calling 911 and screaming about someone falling, giving the address wrong twice before getting it right. Marcus was crying and saying Javier's name over and over like that would wake him up. Aiden was throwing up in the weeds. I knelt next to Javier and checked for a pulse with shaking hands, finding something faint and irregular beneath my fingers. He was alive, but barely, and the amount of blood suggested serious internal injuries. I tried to remember first aid training from health class, something about not moving someone with potential spinal injuries, but my brain was static and useless. The men who'd been threatening us started arguing among themselves, and I caught fragments of their conversation. One saying they needed to leave before cops arrived, another saying they couldn't just abandon someone who was dying, a third saying this was on us for trespassing. Their leader, a grizzled man in his 50s with a long beard, approached us and asked what hospital was closest. Marcus told him County General, and the man pulled out a surprisingly new smartphone and made a call, speaking in low, urgent tones. I wanted to scream at these men that this was their fault for throwing rocks and threatening us, but I also knew we'd provoked this by climbing onto what they'd claimed as their territory. Blame was complicated and circular, and none of it mattered now because Javier was bleeding out on the ground while sirens approached from the distance. The leader man told us to say Javier fell on his own, that nobody threw anything or threatened anyone, otherwise we'd all be charged with trespassing and they'd be charged with assault. The implicit threat was clear: cooperate or face consequences. We were all too shocked to argue. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes, followed immediately by police cars, and suddenly the abandoned industrial park was flooded with lights and emergency personnel. Paramedics swarmed Javier, checking vitals and stabilizing his neck while shouting medical jargon back and forth. They loaded him onto a stretcher and into the ambulance within 3 minutes, working with practiced efficiency that suggested time was critical. One paramedic told us Javier had suffered catastrophic head trauma and internal bleeding, that his chances weren't good, and asked which of us was family. We all said we were just friends, and the paramedic said someone needed to call his parents immediately. Marcus pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed Javier's home number, and I listened to him try to explain to Javier's mother that her son had fallen from a tower and was being rushed to the hospital. Her screams were audible even without speakerphone, raw animal sounds of a parent receiving nightmare news. Marcus ended the call and collapsed into sobs that shook his whole body. The police separated us for interviews, taking each of us to different squad cars to get our statements. The officer questioning me was a middle-aged woman named Sergeant Paulson, who'd clearly dealt with teenage stupidity before. She asked how we'd accessed the tower, why we'd climbed it, whether anyone had forced or coerced us, whether we'd been drinking or using drugs. I answered everything honestly, because lying seemed impossible with Javier's blood still visible on my hands. I told her about the dare, about Marcus's video, about the homeless men throwing rocks and threatening us. Sergeant Paulson's expression hardened when I mentioned the men, and she asked me to describe them in detail. I gave descriptions of the ones I'd seen clearly, including the bearded leader who'd made the phone call. She took extensive notes and then told me something that made my stomach drop. Multiple people falling from towers after being attacked by ground assailants was a known pattern, that these men had likely killed before, and would face serious charges if we could identify them. The trespassing charge suddenly seemed trivial compared to what these men had done. We weren't arrested, but were released to our parents, who arrived in stages over the next hour, each set looking progressively more devastated as they got updates on Javier's condition. My mom and dad showed up together, my mom crying before she even reached me, wrapping me in a hug that felt like both relief and recrimination. My dad just looked old and defeated, aged years in a single night by the knowledge of what his son had done and how close I'd come to being the one falling instead. They drove me to County General Hospital where Javier had been taken, because even though visiting hours were over and we weren't family, we all needed to be there together. The waiting room was slowly filling with our parents and Javier's extended family, who'd come from across the state, all of them waiting for news from surgery that stretched from 1 hour to 3 to 5. A surgeon finally emerged around 6 in the morning, still in scrubs spattered with blood, and delivered news in clinical terms that barely masked the tragedy. Javier had survived surgery, but had suffered severe traumatic brain injury, bilateral pulmonary contusions, and a shattered pelvis. He was in a medically induced coma on life support, and they wouldn't know the extent of brain damage until he woke up, if he woke up. The police investigation moved quickly, and by Saturday afternoon, they had arrested 4 of the men from the industrial park, including the bearded leader whose name turned out to be Dale Pritchard. They were charged with aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and contributing to the serious injury of a minor. The local news picked up the story, framing it as a tragic accident resulting from a teenage dare gone wrong. Reporters showed up at our houses requesting interviews, and our parents issued a joint statement asking for privacy while we dealt with the trauma. But privacy was impossible, because the story went viral by Sunday, the same video phenomenon that had inspired our climb, now amplifying our tragedy. Someone leaked photos from the scene, showing Javier's blood on the ground, and true crime channels started covering the story, analyzing every detail and speculating about what really happened. Our social media accounts were flooded with messages ranging from supportive to viciously critical, people we'd never met calling us idiots who deserved whatever happened, and others calling the homeless men murderers who should face life sentences. On Monday, Javier's condition worsened. He developed pneumonia from his lung injuries, and his kidneys started failing from the trauma. Doctors added dialysis to the list of machines keeping him alive, and his parents made the devastating decision to transfer him to a long-term acute care facility that specialized in patients with catastrophic injuries. The doctors were preparing his parents for the possibility that Javier might never wake up, that the brain damage was extensive enough that he'd remain in a vegetative state indefinitely. I visited him in the ICU once before the transfer, and seeing my friend surrounded by tubes and monitors with a ventilator breathing for him was the worst moment of my life. The Javier I knew, funny, smart, cautious Javier who'd had bad feelings about the climb, was gone, replaced by a swollen, unconscious body that barely looked human. His mother was sitting beside the bed holding his hand and praying in Spanish, and when she saw me, she stood and hugged me so tightly I couldn't breathe. She whispered that she didn't blame me, that boys make mistakes and God would judge, but the kindness in her words made me feel worse than any accusation. The psychological aftermath hit all of us differently, but devastatingly. Marcus stopped coming to school entirely, his parents eventually enrolling him in online classes because he couldn't handle being in the building where everyone knew what had happened. Finn developed severe anxiety and had panic attacks anytime someone mentioned heights or climbing, eventually requiring medication just to function daily. Aiden became obsessed with the legal case against Dale Pritchard and the other men, attending every court hearing and keeping detailed notes about testimony and evidence. He channeled his guilt into righteous fury, convinced that if these men went to prison, then somehow Javier's injuries would have meaning. I retreated into numbness, going through the motions of school and life while feeling disconnected from everything. My therapist diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder and survivor's guilt, terms that sounded abstract until she explained them. I was traumatized by witnessing Javier fall and guilty that I'd survived while he hadn't. The therapy helped somewhat, but nothing could erase the image of Javier plummeting past me or the sound of his body hitting the ground. The preliminary hearing for Dale Pritchard and his co-defendants happened in late October, 2 months after the incident. I was called to testify about what happened that night, and walking into the courtroom was surreal. Dale and 3 other men sat at the defense table looking nothing like the threatening figures from the tower base. They were just middle-aged men in ill-fitting suits, one of them nodding off during the proceedings, all of them looking more pathetic than dangerous. But the prosecutor, a sharp woman named Helen Suarez, painted them as predatory criminals who deliberately endangered minors. She presented evidence that Dale's group had a history of chasing people from the industrial park, using violence and intimidation, that they'd assaulted at least 4 other people in the past year alone. She showed photos of rocks they'd collected at the tower base, ammunition specifically gathered for throwing at climbers. She played 911 calls from previous victims describing being attacked while exploring abandoned buildings in the area. The pattern was clear and damning. My testimony focused on what I'd seen and heard that night: the men gathering at the base, their threats, the rocks hitting the platform and tank. Dale's lawyer tried to cross-examine me about whether we'd provoked the men by trespassing, whether we'd thrown anything down at them first, whether I could truly identify his client in the dark from 150 feet away. I answered every question honestly, because lying would only hurt the case, admitting that we'd trespassed and that we'd made a stupid decision to climb the tower. But I was adamant about what I'd seen and heard, about the deliberate attempt to hurt us that had resulted in Javier's fall. Dale's lawyer suggested that Javier had simply slipped on his own because the ladder was rusty and unstable, that my friends and I were trying to blame others for our own recklessness. The implication made me furious, but I kept my composure and repeated that the men had been throwing rocks and making threats that directly contributed to Javier's panic and subsequent fall. The judge ruled there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial and set a date for February. 3 weeks after the preliminary hearing, I got a call from Aiden that changed everything. He'd been doing obsessive research into Dale Pritchard's background and had found something the police had missed. Dale had a prior conviction from 15 years ago for assault resulting in serious injury. He'd beaten someone nearly to death in a bar fight and served 8 years in prison. That prior conviction changed everything legally, because it meant Dale was a repeat violent offender who could face enhanced sentencing if convicted. More importantly, Aiden had found the victim from that previous assault and convinced him to speak to prosecutors about Dale's pattern of violence. The victim, a man named Thomas Kiley, described Dale as someone who enjoyed hurting people, who'd laughed while beating him and had shown no remorse even at sentencing. This testimony would be crucial for establishing Dale's character and intent during the tower incident. Aiden's discovery gave our case momentum and gave him purpose, something to focus on besides the guilt that was consuming all of us. By December, Javier had been transferred to a long-term care facility that felt more like a warehouse for broken bodies than a hospital. The place smelled like disinfectant and despair, rows of rooms filled with coma patients and severe trauma cases that families visited less and less as hope faded. Javier had developed bed sores despite the staff's efforts, infections that required additional antibiotics, and muscle atrophy that left his arms and legs looking skeletal. His parents still visited daily, his mother bringing photos and playing his favorite music, convinced he could hear her even though doctors said brain activity scans showed minimal consciousness. The facility social worker had gently suggested it might be time to consider end-of-life planning, that Javier's quality of life would be severely compromised even if he woke up, that keeping him on life support indefinitely was extending suffering rather than preserving life. Javier's mother refused to even discuss it, insisting that miracles happened and her son would recover. None of us had the heart to argue with her grief-fueled hope. The trial began on a freezing Monday in February, with the courthouse steps covered in ice and protesters holding signs outside. One group supported us and demanded justice for Javier, holding photos of him before the accident when he'd been healthy and smiling. The other group protested the prosecution of homeless men, arguing that Dale and his co-defendants were being scapegoated for a tragedy caused by reckless teenagers. The dueling narratives made it impossible to have a simple emotional response. We'd been victims of a violent attack, but we'd also been trespassers who'd made an idiotic decision that precipitated everything. The prosecution called us each to testify again, putting the 5 of us on the stand to describe in detail what had happened that night. Marcus cried during his testimony, admitting that the dare had been his idea and he'd pressured everyone to participate. The defense attorney seized on this, suggesting that Marcus's coercion negated any blame on Dale's part since we'd been willing participants in a dangerous activity. Finn testified about the rocks being thrown and nearly hitting him, demonstrating with gestures how close they'd come to causing him to fall too. The defense attorney suggested Finn was exaggerating to absolve himself of responsibility for his friend's injuries. Aiden's testimony was the most powerful because he'd been the one closest to Javier when he fell. He described in excruciating detail the moment the rungs broke, the sound of Javier's scream, the terrible seconds watching him fall while being unable to do anything. He looked directly at Dale while testifying and said, "You did this. Your rocks and your threats made him panic. You killed my friend even though he's still breathing." Dale's face remained impassive throughout, and his lawyer objected to the characterization, but the jury had clearly been affected by Aiden's emotion and directness. My own testimony focused on the threatening behavior and Dale's specific actions, the way he'd directed the others and seemed to take pleasure in our fear. I identified Dale positively as the ringleader, and when his lawyer tried to suggest my memory might be faulty given the darkness and distance, I pointed out that Dale's flashlight had illuminated his face multiple times and his voice had been distinctive and unforgettable. The prosecutor showed the jury photos of the rock collection found at the tower base, dozens of palm-sized stones stacked like ammunition, proof of premeditation and intent. The defense's strategy was to blame us entirely, painting Dale and his co-defendants as marginalized men, just trying to protect their territory from privileged teenagers looking for thrills. Dale's lawyer called witnesses who testified about how dangerous the industrial park was at night, how gangs and drug dealers operated in the area, how the homeless camps were constantly under threat from violent criminals. He suggested that Dale's group had mistaken us for gang members or dealers and had been acting in self-defense when they threw rocks and made threats. The narrative almost worked because there was truth in it. The industrial park was dangerous, and Dale's group had legitimate reasons to be territorial about their living space. But the prosecution countered by showing that Dale had a pattern of violence extending beyond self-defense, that he'd attacked joggers and photographers and urban explorers, anyone who entered what he considered his domain. The pattern demonstrated that this wasn't about self-defense, but about Dale enjoying the power he had over others in that lawless space. The jury deliberated for 4 days, and each day that passed without a verdict increased my anxiety that they might be deadlocked or worse, leaning toward acquittal. We waited in a conference room at the prosecutor's office, Helen Suarez giving us updates every few hours about questions the jury was asking the judge. They'd requested to review testimony about the rock throwing multiple times, which Helen said was a good sign that they were taking the assault charges seriously. On the 4th day, late Friday afternoon, we got word that the jury had reached a verdict. We rushed to the courthouse and filed into the gallery, taking seats directly behind the prosecution table. Dale and his co-defendants were brought in from holding, and for the first time, I saw genuine nervousness on Dale's face as he scanned the jury for clues about their decision. The foreman stood to deliver the verdict, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Guilty on all counts for Dale Pritchard, guilty on lesser charges for 2 of his co-defendants, not guilty for the 4th man who'd apparently not participated in the rock throwing. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions, with Javier's family sobbing in relief and Dale's supporters shouting about injustice. Sentencing was set for 4 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments about appropriate punishment. The prosecutor was asking for 15 years for Dale based on his prior conviction and the severity of Javier's injuries. Dale's lawyer was arguing for 5 years, claiming that Dale hadn't directly caused the fall and that 15 years was excessive for someone whose only crime was defending his territory. The victim impact statements would be crucial, and all of us were preparing to speak about how the incident had destroyed our lives and Javier's future. Aiden spent hours crafting his statement, reading drafts to us and revising based on feedback, determined to make the judge understand the magnitude of what Dale had done. But privately, Aiden admitted that no sentence would feel adequate because nothing could give Javier back his life or undo the trauma we'd all experienced. Justice was about accountability and prevention, not restoration. Dale going to prison wouldn't make Javier wake up or make our nightmares stop. It would just mean that Dale would face consequences for his actions, which was something, but not everything. 2 weeks before sentencing, Javier died. His kidneys had failed completely, and his body couldn't sustain life even with the machines doing most of the work. His parents made the decision to remove life support and let him go peacefully, surrounded by family and friends who'd kept vigil throughout his long ordeal. I was there when they turned off the ventilator, watching his chest rise and fall on its own for a few breaths before the intervals lengthened and then stopped entirely. The monitor's steady beep turned into a flat, sustained tone that would haunt me forever, the sound of a life ending and a future erased. Javier was 16 years old when he died, 5 months after climbing a tower on a dare that was supposed to make us legends. His funeral was packed with hundreds of people, classmates, teachers, family members, and even strangers who'd followed the case and wanted to pay respects. The local news covered it extensively, interviewing mourners about the tragedy of a life cut short and the dangers of teenage dares. Some of the coverage was sympathetic, but other segments criticized us for our recklessness and questioned whether we bore responsibility for our friend's death. Dale's sentencing hearing became even more critical after Javier's death, because now the charges included manslaughter. The prosecutor added the new charge based on Javier's death resulting from injuries sustained during Dale's assault. This changed everything legally, because manslaughter carried a potential sentence of up to 25 years. Helen Suarez presented the updated charges to the judge, along with extensive documentation of Javier's medical trajectory from the initial injuries through to his death 5 months later. Dale's lawyer tried to argue that too much time had passed to directly attribute Javier's death to the tower incident, that complications and infections in the interim broke the causal chain. But medical experts testified that every complication Javier suffered stemmed directly from the initial trauma, that he'd never have been in that vulnerable state without Dale's actions. The judge accepted the manslaughter charge, and suddenly Dale was facing the possibility of decades in prison rather than years. The victim impact statements took an entire day, with Javier's parents speaking first. His mother read from a prepared statement in Spanish that was translated for the court, describing her son's dreams of becoming an engineer and his love for his family. She talked about the months of watching him slowly die, of praying for miracles that never came, of the empty chair at their dinner table that would never be filled. His father spoke more briefly but with devastating effect, directing his words to Dale and saying, "You took my son from this world. You stole his future and destroyed our family. I hope you spend every day in prison thinking about the boy you killed." Dale's face remained expressionless, but I saw his lawyer put a hand on his shoulder as if to steady him. Our statements came next, with Marcus going first and breaking down within seconds, unable to finish his prepared remarks through his sobs. Finn spoke about survivor's guilt and PTSD, about nightmares where he's the one falling and wakes up screaming. Aiden delivered his statement with controlled fury, meticulously documenting every way Dale's actions had resulted in Javier's death and our trauma. My own statement was the last, and I'd struggled for weeks with what to say. I finally decided to speak directly to other teenagers who might see our story and think climbing abandoned structures was worth the risk. I talked about how the dare had seemed exciting and harmless, how none of us understood the actual danger until it was too late. I described watching Javier fall and knowing in that instant that our lives had changed forever. I talked about the 5 months of watching him slowly die, of carrying guilt that felt like a physical weight I couldn't put down. I said that Dale deserved severe punishment for his actions, but that we also bore responsibility for putting ourselves in that situation. I asked the judge to consider that this tragedy was preventable at multiple points. If we'd chosen not to climb, if Dale had chosen not to attack us, if the tower had been properly secured or demolished, as it should have been years ago. The failures were systemic and individual, and while Dale needed to be held accountable, we also needed to learn and change, so no other teenage dare ended with someone on life support. Several jurors and spectators were crying by the time I finished, and even the judge looked affected as she made notes. Dale's lawyer presented his sentencing argument, emphasizing Dale's difficult upbringing, his homelessness, his lack of education and opportunities. He portrayed Dale as a product of systemic failure, a man who'd fallen through every social safety net and ended up living in an industrial wasteland because society had abandoned him. The lawyer argued that sending Dale to prison for decades would accomplish nothing except removing another troubled man from the streets temporarily. He suggested that Dale needed mental health treatment and housing support, not punishment. The argument might have been compelling if not for Dale's prior conviction and the evidence of his enjoying violence rather than reluctantly engaging in it. Helen Suarez countered that Dale had made deliberate choices to hurt people, that his circumstances didn't excuse his actions, and that the community needed protection from someone who'd proven repeatedly that he was dangerous. She asked the judge to impose a sentence that reflected the severity of Dale's crimes and the permanent harm he'd caused. The judge took a recess to review everything before delivering her sentence. When she returned and asked Dale to stand, the courtroom went completely silent. She spoke for nearly 30 minutes, walking through the evidence, the aggravating and mitigating factors, and her reasoning. She acknowledged Dale's difficult circumstances, but emphasized that many people experience poverty and homelessness without resorting to violence. She noted his prior convictions showing a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. She discussed the specific actions he'd taken that night, gathering rocks, directing others to throw them, making explicit threats that demonstrated intent to harm rather than simply defend territory. She spoke about Javier's death and the destroyed futures, not just his, but also his friends, who would carry this trauma forever. Then she delivered the sentence: 23 years in state prison for manslaughter and aggravated assault, with credit for time served and eligibility for parole after 18 years. Dale's face finally showed emotion, a flash of anger and despair as he realized he'd be in prison until he was in his 70s. His supporters in the gallery cried out, and bailiffs had to maintain order as Dale was led away in handcuffs. The two co-defendants, who'd been convicted on lesser charges, received sentences of 7 and 9 years respectively, still substantial but reflective of their more limited roles. They'd thrown rocks, but hadn't been the ringleaders, and they'd expressed remorse that Dale had never shown. The verdicts and sentences made national news with legal experts, debating whether 23 years was appropriate for someone whose actions had contributed to, but not directly caused, a death. Some argued it was too harsh given Dale's circumstances and the teenager's own recklessness. Others said it was appropriate accountability for someone who deliberately endangered minors. The debate raged on social media and legal forums, but for those of us directly affected, the sentence brought not closure, but a kind of grim satisfaction. Dale would face consequences for his actions, and that mattered, even if it couldn't bring Javier back or erase our trauma. The legal process had been grueling and painful, but it had also established accountability and precedent. Future Dale Pritchards might think twice before attacking people on their territory, and future teenagers might think twice before climbing abandoned structures on dares. In the months after sentencing, we slowly began trying to rebuild our lives from the wreckage. Marcus eventually returned to school for senior year, walking the hallways with his head down and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Finn's panic attacks decreased with continued therapy and medication, though he still couldn't look at heights without physical symptoms. Aiden channeled his experience into advocacy, starting a school organization focused on discussing peer pressure and dangerous dares, using our story as a cautionary tale. He gave presentations to middle school students about decision-making and consequences, and found some healing in preventing others from making our mistakes. I continued therapy and slowly worked through the PTSD, learning techniques to manage intrusive thoughts and flashbacks. My therapist said I might always carry some trauma from what I'd witnessed, but that I could learn to live alongside it, rather than being controlled by it. The nightmares became less frequent, and I started sleeping through the night without jerking awake in a panic, believing I was falling. We graduated high school that June, in a ceremony that felt hollow, because Javier should have been there with us. The school had reserved a seat for him with his cap and gown draped over it, a memorial that made everyone in the auditorium cry. His parents attended and accepted his honorary diploma, and the applause was thunderous and sustained, a collective acknowledgement of loss. None of us took photos at the tower that night as Marcus had planned, but yearbook staff had created a memorial page with photos of Javier throughout his high school years, smiling and alive and unaware of how his story would end. The page reminded everyone that Javier hadn't just been a victim or a cautionary tale. He'd been a real person with interests and humor and a future that had been stolen. College applications that fall felt surreal because I was planning a future while Javier had none. I wrote my admissions essay about the tower incident and what I'd learned about consequence and accountability, and several schools commented that it was the most impactful essay they'd read that year. I chose a college 3 states away, needing distance from the tower and the memories and the constant reminder of what we'd done. Years passed with the kind of slow healing that never quite completes, but gradually becomes bearable. I finished college, started a career, built relationships, and created a life that bore little resemblance to that night at the tower. But Javier was always there in the background, a presence in every risk assessment I made, every decision about safety versus adventure. I visited his grave on the anniversary of his death each year, bringing flowers and spending time telling him about what I'd been doing, about the life he should have had. His parents aged rapidly from grief, his mother developing health problems that doctors attributed partly to stress and heartbreak. They'd filed a civil lawsuit against the city for failing to secure the tower properly, and the settlement helped pay for Javier's medical bills and funeral costs, but money couldn't address the fundamental loss. Marcus moved to another state and cut contact with all of us, unable to live with the guilt of having suggested the dare. Finn became a therapist, specializing in trauma, using his own experience to help others. Aiden went to law school and became a prosecutor focused on assault cases, channeling his desire for justice into his career. A decade after Javier's death, I received notification that Dale Pritchard was up for parole. The hearing would happen in 3 months, and victim representatives were invited to submit statements about whether Dale should be released. I spent weeks agonizing over what to write, trying to balance my belief that Dale deserved punishment with the knowledge that he'd served significant time and that indefinite imprisonment served no one. I ultimately wrote a statement acknowledging that Dale had served 10 years of a 23-year sentence, that he'd been found guilty and had faced consequences, but that Javier's death was permanent and Dale's release would be devastating to the family. I noted that Dale had never expressed genuine remorse during trial or in prison correspondence that had been shared with victims. I said that parole should require not just time served but demonstrated rehabilitation and understanding of harm caused, and that Dale hadn't shown that understanding. The parole board denied Dale's application, determining that he remained a risk to public safety and hadn't completed sufficient rehabilitation programming. He'd be eligible to reapply in 3 years, and I knew I'd be writing a similar statement then, a cycle that would continue until Dale was either released or died in prison. Now, 15 years after that sleepover dare, I'm 31 with my own family, and a life that barely intersects with the teenager who climbed a water tower on a September night. But Javier is still 16 in my memories, still falling past me in the dark, still lying broken on the ground, while we all realized that choices have consequences we can't foresee or control. I think about him whenever my own children take risks or test boundaries, and I struggle with how to teach them caution without instilling paralyzing fear. I think about Dale Pritchard rotting in prison and whether anyone is better off for his incarceration or whether it's just punishment without redemption. I think about the tower, finally demolished 3 years after Javier's death, torn down in a single afternoon and hauled away like it had never existed. The industrial park has been redeveloped into lofts and coffee shops, the homeless camps cleared out, and the dangerous spaces gentrified into safe ones. Progress, maybe, but also erasure of the place where Javier died and where 5 teenage boys learned that invincibility is an illusion and that some dares cost more than anyone should have to pay. 3 of my friends ended up on life support that night, though only Javier died. The rest of us have lived on, carrying pieces of him in our trauma and our choices, survivors of a tragedy that should never have happened and now must never be forgotten. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.